In our past videos, we discussed the infamous Pope Alexander VI and his family. He was often viewed as the embodiment of absolute evil in the era of the secular popes. Cesare Borgia was his son. Along with his sister Lucrezia, Cesare's name also comes down in history as the embodiment of the scandal and corruption of the time. He was often regarded as a ruthless killer and deeply immoral man. But he also inspired one of the most famous books of all time, Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince. Cesare Borgia was the eldest son of Alexander VI and Vannozza dei Catanei. He seemed to have been groomed to become his father's successor in the church. Thanks to his father being the Pope, Cesare became a bishop from the beginning without ever serving as a priest, and soon after, a cardinal. His quick ascent within the church faced intense opposition, but Alexander VI was not the kind of person who would be stopped by any criticism. And he pushed his son into positions of power. He had a younger brother from the same mother, Giovanni. Giovanni was groomed to become the family's head in the secular world. Cesare had a complex relationship with Giovanni. Usually, in noble families, it was not uncommon for the eldest son to inherit the family title and the younger son to enter the priesthood. And perhaps because Cesare became a priest, while Giovanni inherited Borgia family's Duchy of Gandia and became the Duke of Gandia, historians debated whether Giovanni was the eldest son and Cesare is the younger brother. But modern historians agree that Cesare was in fact the eldest son and Giovanni was the younger one. While Giovanni had a more carefree and laid-back demeanor and extravagant lifestyle, Cesare was known for his cold, calculating demeanor and his ability to mask his emotions. Perhaps because his father favored the younger brother Giovanni, Cesare appears to have been a moody, brooding type. Cesare also seemed to have had severe mood swings, often experiencing intense period of energy, drive, and ambition, followed by periods of lethargy and depression. In modern terms, he might have been suffering from bipolar disorder, or at least severe mood swings. He also had merciless drive for revenge. If his honor or reputation was challenged, he would stop at nothing to exact revenge, often with deadly consequences. The relationship between Cesare and his father was complex, full of love, resentment, and at times rivalry. He longed for his father's approval, but it was always his younger brother Giovanni who seemed to receive more of Alexander's affection. Both brothers coveted the title of Captain General of the papal armies, but Giovanni was awarded the position. Cesare was appointed a cardinal instead. Cesare was disappointed and resented his brother for it. And this wasn't the first time he felt slighted by Giovanni. The Borgia family held the Duchy of Gandia, and the previous duke was Cesare's half-brother from Alexander's another mistress, Pedro Luis. When Pedro Luis had died a few years earlier, the title of Duke of Gandia should have gone to Cesare, but it went to Giovanni. While he couldn't go against his father's wishes, he was constantly looking for an opportunity to outdo his brother and to show his father that he, not Giovanni, was better suited to help Alexander. This rivalry led to growing tensions between them. But what really angered Cesare was his father's plan to create a separate principality in Italy for Giovanni. Alexander VI wanted to carve out some territories from the papal state and give it to the Duchy of Gandia, which means Giovanni and his descendants will have that land as their own territory in Italy. This was something Cesare really wanted for himself. For this to be simply given to Giovanni was unacceptable for Cesare. 1 week after Alexander's decision to give this land to the Duchy of Gandia, Giovanni had dinner with his mother Vannozza and left her house. When he didn't return home next day, the Pope started looking for his son. And after a fisherman came forward and said he saw 5 men dumping what looked like a body into the river Tiber, Alexander had the river searched and finally found Giovanni's body. His clothes was weighed down with stones to prevent his body from floating. and the body had stab wounds in the neck, head, torso, and legs. It was clear this wasn't a simple robbery, since his purse with quite a bit of money was still hanging at his belt. There were many suspects for Giovanni's murder. Alexander VI had many enemies, and as the captain general of the papal armies, Giovanni also made enemies of many powerful families who had controlled the various regions in Italy. The Orsini family or the Sforza family each had reasons to want to kill him, and they had powerful family members in Rome at that time. But many people thought it was in fact his brother Cesare who murdered Giovanni. In addition to the conflict over his father's approval, the two had another quarrel over a woman too, and that was over Sancha of Aragon, who was actually married to Cesare and Giovanni's younger brother Geoffrey. Sancha was having affairs with both Cesare and Giovanni at the same time, and some said that the two were arguing over her on the night Giovanni died. Hearing this, you might wonder what kind of woman this Sancha was. Sancha was an illegitimate daughter of King Alfonso II of Naples. Her marriage to Geoffrey was part of the arrangement between Naples and the Pope to ally with each other. When she first got married and moved into the Pope's palace in 1494, she was 16 and Geoffrey was 12. And then there was the elder brother Cesare, who was 19. So it was almost natural for this 16-year-old girl to be more interested in Cesare than her much younger husband. At that time, Giovanni was in Spain in his family estate in Gandia. Then, 2 years into Sancha's marriage in 1496, Giovanni came back to Italy. Sancha may have been attracted to this new man who was more easygoing and fun-loving than the serious and gloomy Cesare. And then, the two elder Borgia brothers were not really the type who cared much about a girl being married to another person or being a mistress of another. And let's face it, they had a father with a severe moral depravity and a mother who was married to another man but had a long-term affair with a priest and had 4 children. So expecting them to care about sanctity of marriage before a young and attractive girl might have been asking for too much. Anyways, so it seems Sancha had an affair with both Cesare and Giovanni, and some cite this as a potential motive for Cesare to murder Giovanni. Pope Alexander VI initially had the murder investigated, but at some point, he stopped the investigation and made no further attempt to identify the killer or to seek revenge for his son. Many thought that this was because he found out it was Cesare who killed Giovanni and covered it up to protect Cesare. But other than the fact that Cesare was known to have been extremely jealous of his brother, no evidence that Cesare murdered Giovanni was ever proven. After Giovanni's death, Cesare, who never really cared for the life in church, officially resigned from the cardinalate and became the commander of the papal armies. He might have been satisfied with being his father's chief enforcer, but when Francis Louis XII invaded Italy, Cesare's worldview changed. He allied with France and married Louis's cousin, Charlotte d'Arbrès, and, with the French backing, the new captain general of the papal army Cesare began a systematic occupation of the cities of Romagna and the Marches region. Alexander VI and Cesare wanted to establish the papal state's control over these regions and eventually to carve out a permanent Borgia state in Italy. His military prowess and political ambition led many to speculate that he might unify the entire Italian peninsula under his rule. And for Cesare, now his father was simply one of the power bases he can use, but he no longer felt confined to serving his father. And his alliance with the French brought about another family drama. As we discussed in our video on Lucrezia, the Borgias previously allied with Naples through double marriages between Sancha and Geoffrey first, and then the marriage between Lucrezia and Sancha's brother Alfonso of Aragon. When this marriage alliance became inconvenient for the Borgias, Alfonso was famously murdered inside the Borgia palace in year 1500. This incident fueled widespread rumor that Cesare orchestrated his brother-in-law's death, either out of jealousy or political expediency. The event only deepened the air of treachery surrounding the Borgia family. For him to be murdered inside the Borgia castle was impossible unless there was someone from inside helping the murderer. Again, people suspected Cesare, but this also was never proven. As for Sancha, she did not become a target of assassination, but she was imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome until the death of Pope Alexander VI in 1503. After that, Sancha returned to Naples with Lucrezia and Alfonso's son Rodrigo, and raised him. She never had a child of her own. Cesare's ruthlessness wasn't confined to family matters. As a commander for King Louis XII of France, he led a series of brutal campaigns, one of the most notorious being the Siege of Capua. After capturing the city, Cesare reportedly ordered a massacre of 3,000 inhabitants, including women and children. When King Louis XII learned of this massacre, he was appalled. He confronted Cesare and questioned his tactics. Cesare's response was that it was a calculated move. It was to break the will of his opponents and to ensure swift surrenders in future conquests. And this was indeed effective. Many cities surrendered without a fight upon hearing of Cesare's advance. But this incident earned him a reputation as a bloodthirsty tyrant. Louis XII reportedly distanced himself from Cesare afterward, unwilling to be associated with such ruthless methods. Yet, Cesare's strategy worked. His fearsome reputation often won battles before a single sword was drawn. Cesare Borgia's reputation as a master of deception solidified his place in history as both a villain and a model of cunning leadership. Known for his ability to smile while plotting betrayal, Cesare once famously dealt with rebellious mercenary captains by feigning camaraderie. He individually reassured and flattered them, luring them into a false sense of security. Then, under the guise of reconciliation, he gathered them in one place, only to have them all arrested and executed. Such brutality not only eliminated his immediate threats, but also sent a chilling message to anyone even thinking of betraying Cesare. It was this blend of calculated cruelty and strategic genius that fascinated Niccolò Machiavelli. In The Prince, Machiavelli presents Cesare as an ideal ruler, not because his morality, but because of his effectiveness. He admired Cesare's ability to consolidate power and maintain control through a mix of fear, manipulation, and swift, decisive action. Machiavelli's controversial endorsement of such methods has led many to criticize The Prince as a manual for tyranny. However, Machiavelli's primary concern wasn't moral righteousness but political survival. So he minimizes the discussion of the morality of the ruler, but focuses on the political and diplomatic impact of the outward actions. Also, we should keep in mind that The Prince was written for leaders of small regions and city-states, not the monarchs of vast lands like French or Spanish kings. Machiavelli wrote The Prince primarily to gain favor with the Medici family, particularly Lorenzo de' Medici, who was the grandson of the Lorenzo il Magnifico we discussed in earlier videos. The Medici family had lost power and exile from Florence for a while, and Machiavelli had sided with their enemies. And then, when the Medici family came back to Florence, Machiavelli was exiled. He wrote The Prince to secure a position as a political advisor in the Florentine government, again under the Medici rule. And at that time, Italy was a fragmented battleground of city-states and foreign powers. Leaders of small states like Florence or Milan could not rely on the kind of legitimacy or resources that monarchs in France or Spain enjoyed. They needed to be shrewd, adaptable, and when necessary, ruthless to ensure their survival amid the constant threat of invasion or internal rebellion. And Machiavelli saw Cesare Borgia as a leader who thrived in these conditions. Despite lacking a traditional power base, Cesare had managed to carve out a significant domain through sheer audacity and strategic brilliance. He could be charming and generous when it served his purpose, yet merciless when it came to securing his position. His ability to inspire fear was particularly noteworthy. Many cities surrendered to him without resistance simply because of his terrifying reputation. For Machiavelli, this combination of fear, cunning, and calculated ruthlessness was not just desirable, but necessary for a ruler seeking to navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics. In his eyes, Cesare Borgia represented a new kind of pragmatic leadership, one that could survive and even thrive in a world where traditional virtues often led to ruin. In 1503, Cesare and Alexander VI had dinner with Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. All three of them fell ill the next day. Cesare and the cardinal survived, but Alexander VI died a week later. When the Pope died, Cesare sent Micheletto Corella to clear out the Pope's treasures before the death was officially announced. Apparently, Cesare was too sick to do it himself. And if the name Micheletto Corella sounds familiar, that's the same Micheletto Corella who strangled Lucrezia's second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, in his bed. Rumors soon started circulating that the Pope was poisoned, and it was a case of an attempted poisoning of their enemy that had somehow gone wrong. But there was no proof that any of them had been poisoned, and the Pope is generally believed to have died from malaria. After Alexander's death, the papacy went to Pope Pius III, and then, when he died less than a month later, to Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. He became Pope Julius II. He had been at odds with the Borgias, and did not support Cesare's further campaigns. And, without the papal backing, and with so many enemies he created along the way, Cesare's power crumbled. He himself was captured in Naples and was sent to Spain as a prisoner. He did manage to escape and went to his brother-in-law in Navarre, and from there became a commander for the French army. He did see some military success, but in 1507 died in the battlefield. Apparently he stood out too much, because he wore garments that were too luxurious, so the enemy soldiers found out who he was and trapped him in an ambush and killed him. The soldiers stripped all of his luxurious garments and valuables from his body, so his body was left lying naked. He could not really rest in peace even after his death either. His body was originally buried at the Church of Santa Maria in Viana in Navarre in modern-day Spain. But he and his family had far too many enemies. It is said the Bishop of Santa Maria had his bones taken out of the church because his own father had died after being imprisoned under Alexander VI. His bones were then reburied under the street in front of the church, and this church is on the path of Camino del Santiago, which is a famous pilgrimage route. So his body was under the street for all the pilgrims to walk on them for nearly 500 years. Then, the bones were reburied just outside the church, but no longer under the streets these days. So today, we looked at the life of Cesare Borgia and his end. In our next video, we will go back in time a little bit to the time Alexander VI was still alive and see how he dealt with a famous pastor who called for the reform of the church. So please like and subscribe to continue receiving our next installment. Also check out our playlists for other interesting stories from history. It really helps a small channel like us.